Now let's discuss facing a turn pro bet by going through a few examples. Here we have the 9-7-5 board. Remember back, this is a spot where under the gun +1 is going to check behind on this flop a decent chunk of the time. Now the turn comes. As you can see, the high cards are better for the under the gun +1 player. Lower cards are better for the big blind. That makes logical sense, right? And in this scenario, let's presume the turn is the 6, which is a very good card for the big blind. And the big blind makes that small bet, as they should do, we saw in the previous section, something like 70% of the time. So we know that they are betting this turn very, 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 very frequently. All right, let's go through and take a look at our range. Remember, our range is going to be missing a lot of hands because we would have bet all of those on the flop. As you can see on 9-7-5, we're betting hands like queens, ace-9, ace-10 suited, all of our weaker hands that we could potentially have. And our checking range is a lot of ace-highs, some middle pairs, some top pairs, and a few slow plays, right? Aces and kings. And notice, these few slow plays are actually going to become very important. So in this scenario, let's categorize the specific range that we actually have here. This is not the same range the solver is going to have because they're going to be very mixed in this scenario where they are, betting some hands and checking some hands. So solver is probably going to have more straights than I do in this scenario just because on this particular card we happen to not have very many. So we'll categorize our hands. I realize an 8 is a premium hand here. So like you could say you wanted to raise it. We don't really have any draws though. So like I naturally know we have clearly no draws on this turn. So given we have basically no draws on this turn, facing a bet, we should essentially never raise. But if you wanted to have a small raising percentage here, I think it's certainly fine. We could raise with some draws, like flush draws. We could also raise with perhaps some 10s. And we could raise with the pocket 8s and the king 8 suited. But that's it. You don't want to raise with sets here, I don't think, because, you could just be running into the 8. I do think raising a set could be viable here. If I had 2 pair, though, I would not raise 2 pair. You can justify raising a set because, remember, your opponent's going to be leading the turn or probing the turn here with a lot of, like 9s, which a 6 is in great shape against. Anyway, a lot of calling, though, right? Perhaps not calling quite at the minimum defense frequency in this scenario because this is a terrible card for this particular range we get to the turn with, but we're still calling a lot. Like with ace high, I want to make it clear. Boards 9, 7, 5, 6. When our opponent bets, we are calling with ace high, okay? Like ace king and ace queen. And we're calling with a 1 pair hand like a 7 or a 5. It's not going to be particularly great going to the river, but this is what you have to do in scenarios like this, where you recognize my opponent should be betting a lot with a lot of their king highs, queen highs, jack highs, etc. And in turn, you cannot be too happy to fold. What a lot of people do wrong in this spot is they fold way too often. Notice if I didn't have aces and kings in my range because I bet them all on the flop, notice now we'd have 12 fewer combinations of marginal made hands, which would make us have more junk than we're allowed to have, right? According to that 70-30 ratio. Notice if we fold out ace king and ace queen here. That's, I don't know, let's just say we fold out all the ace kings. I know we're not folding ace king of spades, but let's say we're folding 16 combinations of hands. Now again, we're going to be drastically overfolding. So we have to be willing to stick around in this spot, even though I know it's pretty gross. Of course, if your opponent is a player who's not bluffing here nearly often enough, you should be overfolding in this spot. So always make sure you adjust to whatever your opponent does wrong. And as we get to these more like corner case scenarios, you will find that you can exploit your opponents pretty hard. But if you're playing against a good, strong GTO opponent, I think this is roughly what you want to do. So I'm folding 27%. Solver folds even less, 26%. As you see, Solver mostly calls with these ace highs. Solver does relatively little raising. I guess 20% raising is a lot. Notice Solver has more 8s than I do, right? Which is why, like I said, given the way my particular range lines up, I have almost no 8s, therefore we're not going to be raising. But if we did have more 8s like the Solver, we would want to raise the 8s. And like I said, the 10s are going to be good bluff hands too, which is what the Solver does use. So that makes good logical sense, right? But again, I want to point out these 1 pair hands are all calling. The aces are often calling. So you cannot overfold in this scenario. Notice Jack 10 for a gut shot. Always calls. Did I have Jack 10? I did not. Okay. Let's take a look at the 7 turn. So this is a spot where we had the player in the big blind probing big for 120% pot. Whenever they use that polarized size, we're basically never going to raise, right? So even though we do have some nut hands like ace 7 suited, notice we have almost no nut hands. because there's only ace-7 suited, and we have a lot of junk. When they bet big, we get to fold out our junk, okay? Remember, when they're betting big, they're very polarized. You can realistically only continue with hands that can beat their bluffs. And in this scenario, there are not a whole lot of hands that can beat their bluffs. And you can continue with draws that have good equity, like, ace-4 of spades for backdoor flush draw. Notice we're folding out ace-queen and ace-jack, but still calling ace-king. There's some line in here where, like, the ace-x should be generally folded. We see that the solver uses mixed strategies across the board anyway, but typically I continue with my best ace-highs and don't continue with my worst ace-highs, right? Also, aces and kings just call. No reason to raise a big probe because your opponent's going to be very, very polarized. And as we see here, no raising percentage. Ace-king does call. Ace-queen calls sometimes. Ace-jack calls sometimes, like I said. The solver's going to use very mixed strategies. Everything else folds, right? I mean, here we have these ace-x of spades. All these flush draws continue if you have them in your range. I think I had us betting the backdoor flush draws that were king-high on the flop, which is why you see we don't have them in our range, right? Because I bet all those on the flop, but I did not bet the ace-high ones. So, we're going to be somewhat weighted to not having those because of the way we structured our range. And you're going to find that, like, you have to understand there are various turns that are better for the way I'm using this implementable strategy compared to the solver, and there are better turns for the solver compared to my implementable strategy. But on average, it'll average out across the board. And, the implementable strategy will be a whole lot easier to play. So anyway, this is a spot where, as you see, really just not a lot of raising. And essentially you want to ask yourself, do I have a lot of nut hands? If you don't have a lot of nut hands, you don't get to raise.